have to nitpick something. So, I mean, I've heard it all my career. You know, when I was coming out of high school, the college coaches, you know, said the same thing, and I proved them wrong. And, you know, that's something that I anticipate doing again. Obviously, like I said, I don't have the stereotypical, you know, offensive lineman if you had to draw one up in your mind, arm length. But, you know, everything is blocked with your feet. You know, and that's where I excel. I feel like my footwork, I can match it with anybody I need to.
Does arm length matter when it comes to tackles in the NFL? It depends who you ask. Left tackle from LSU, Will Campbell, would be the #1 lineman, but his arms are 3/8 of an inch too short to some. Former Bears offensive lineman and radio analyst Tom Thayer has been studying the O-line prospects for the last week, as well as the Bears trades, and I caught up with him to get his reaction to the Bears moves. Well, Tom, this is a very fluid week. I thought the Bears would attack the offensive line in free agency, but they get a head start making 2 trades in less than 24 hours. They bring in 2 All-Pro linemen, first Jonah Jackson and now Joe Thuney. First off, your reaction to both of the trades.
You know, one thing about the offensive line room, Cassie, I think that room has to be transitioned to the most competitive room inside the football team. Because the way we finish the season with that type of talent, I think they have to upgrade the talent. They have to upgrade the competitiveness of the talent. They need to increase the alpha male presence inside that meeting room. And I think they did it with both of these guys. I think these guys that have a lot of experience, all pro experience, that they can teach a lot of lessons to guys that are just starting to get their feet wet in the NFL. So, you talk about the transition of an offensive line room in such a short amount of time, they're doing it.
Yeah, and I love with Joe Thuney, one, you're getting one of the best guards that could possibly play in the NFL right now. He played in 3 Super Bowls in his first 3 seasons, and you talk about just needing winners in the locker room. That's your guy right there. I think it's interesting that they signed 2 guys, though, that play left guard primarily. So how do you think that's going to shake out between the 2 of them?
You know, I think Thuney, he's a bona fide left guard. That's what he's played a majority of his career, although he played some left tackle as well. But I think if you get a guy like Jonah Jackson and he's right-handed, it's easy to make that transition from left guard to right guard. And you're probably under a more balanced position if you're playing the position that the hand that you favor anyways. So I don't think it's a hard time. Anybody that has played offensive guard, and I've done that for quite a while. I played left guard in college and I played right guard in the NFL. It's not that big of a transition. It is when you're talking about the offensive tackle position because you have a lot more ground to cover. Your balance is more of a factor in the immediacy of what you have to do to be competitive at the position. But I think both of these guys are more than capable of playing any interior position, and I'll even include center in that. So if they feel that there's an emergency need anywhere on the interior, I think they got 2 really capable veterans.
We're going to talk about the center position in a little bit, but when it comes to Jonah Jackson, people were concerned right off the bat that is this similar to a Nate Davis situation because he didn't end up playing much due to injury when he was with the Rams. However, I talked to Dan Miller in Detroit. He's the voice of the Lions, and he said, no, he's a grade A guy in the locker room, and he was proud of how he handled kind of everything that went down in LA too. But do you have any injury concerns given the fact that he was, you know, dealing with some when he was with the Rams last year, going into his first year in a new deal?
I don't have any injury concerns because he was injured last year. He hasn't been injured in the past. So I do think when you have a guy like Ben Johnson who's been around him, he knows his personality. He knows his work ethic. He knows his commitment to being a professional football player. A lot of those obstacles are already out of the way. And when you talk about an offensive line room, you need a lot of guys, man, because you talk about this Bears team. So since 2022, there's been 24 different starting offensive lineups. There's been 62 different combinations, and there's been 89 in-game changes outside of unbalanced lines. So whether you're talking about Joe Thuney and Jonah, or you're talking about some of the free agents and draft choices they'll bring in, you're trying to create a competitive atmosphere that you have guys at the front of the line that have experience, and you're asking those guys at the front of the line to be teachers and mentors to the guys that are behind you in line.
Ben Johnson was asked if you can overhaul an offensive line in one offseason. This was last week at the Combine. He said, yes, he believes you can, and we saw it happen with the Carolina Panthers last year. How much more relevant does this make the Bears in the grand scheme of things across the NFL that they've already poured some resources and given away late draft capital for these two guys?
I think it's significant in when you're talking about changing an offensive line within 1 year. Because you listen, I just spent the last 5 or 6 days watching the Combine and taking into account every position, but really focusing on the offense and defensive line. So you're not gonna be left behind. You're kind of gonna be out in front of the battle to get this group upgraded. And when you talk about bringing in 2 experienced offensive linemen, playing them at the position that they probably are most fit to play. And then, you still have a guy like Karam Amagaji who's got the template to fit anywhere on the offensive line. You got Darnell Wright in what he is transitioning into in terms of becoming a veteran in the NFL. And then there's qualified guys within this draft that I think you can bring in as plug and play players. And so the Bears have the assets in the draft in the early rounds, and they have those quality of players that can come in and benefit from the experience of a Joe Thuney, benefit from the experience of a Jonah Jackson, and make sure that their learning curve is expedited, because not only do they have an experienced offensive line coach, but they're playing next to a guy that's got a world of experience that can speed up their learning curve.
Are you still in favor for them going after someone like a center, Drew Dahlman, in free agency next week, even if it costs them $13-14 million a year, given the fact that you're still working with a young quarterback and you want someone who has that veteran experience on the offensive line at the center position?
I'm kind of both there, because I think there's qualified guys at the Combine that can come in and be day one starters at the center position. But if you bring in an experienced center, you're talking about having veteran experience across the board in the middle. And you talk about what security that gives a guy like Caleb Williams, who's not only going to be learning a new system, but he's also going to have confidence in that protection and the communication up front. And so you're not necessarily teaching a rookie how to communicate with 2 veteran guards. You may be teaching 3 veterans how to communicate amongst each other. So I'm not against going out and kicking the tires on Dahlman, but I do think Ryan Poles and his staff will do their due diligence in the candidates that will be offered to them on draft weekend.
One interesting thing I heard at the NFL Combine is that Will Campbell has position flexibility. He can also play center. And we're talking about his arm length right now, that it's under that 33-inch threshold. So does that make him a tackle? Does it make him a guard? Do you think Will Campbell could play center if he's available at 10?
I think Will Campbell could play any position up and down the offensive line, including right tackle. And I don't care about arm length, Cassie.
Why?
That's one of my points
Everyone
of contention.
cares about it.
Because Cassie, I think if you and I were sitting and watching tape of a game, and we didn't have access to the upper body of Will Campbell, we could only watch from the waist down. What he's going to show you, he's got the feet, the athleticism, the recovery, and the power to play the position. And I happen to play with one of those guys that arm length was criticized in Jimbo Covert, and he was the most dominant left tackle in the league from the moment that he came out of Pitt onto the Chicago Bears practice field. So I don't ever think that arm length is, I take that into consideration. I want to see if you have the athleticism and everything else that you need efforted in order to get yourself in position to even be considered as an NFL candidate.
So enlighten everyone. Why do people freak out about the arm length?
Because it's a false measurable. It's something easy to talk about. Because I've seen guys come across the NFL in my last 40 years that had arm length that was emphasized, but then they didn't have the feet and they didn't have the power to be able to play the position. I just think that when you talk about arm length, if you can't get yourself in position and you're going to rely on the length of your arms, you're going to lose a lot of battles. It's like going to watch a highlight tape of Myles Garrett that you can see right now on every sports channel that there is out there. The first thing that Myles Garrett does to an offensive lineman that he plays against is he caves in their arms, he gets to their body, and then he's in control of the rush. To me, if you don't have the feet to get in front of the defender that you're playing against in your assignment and be in a powerful position, it doesn't matter if you have 45-inch arms or 30 whatever inch arms. So I have all the confidence in the world that Will Campbell can play any position that any team that drafts him asks them to.
All right, so for the people who are kind of enamored with that number and will say that his arms are too short for him to play tackle, do you think he'll drop to 10? And if he does, is that who you would pick if you were Ryan Poles and he was available?
You know, there's a couple of guys that I have a lot of interest in, but if Will Campbell is there at 10, and I do have determined that he can be a day one starter at left tackle for me and hopefully grow into that position over the next 10 years, and then over the next whatever amount of years with Joe Thuney, I would have all the confidence in the world in taking him. But I'm not going to limit myself to only Will, because if he's not there, then I don't want to say, oh my God, the sky is falling. Now we have to look at an unrealistic pick. If Will's not there, there's a couple of other guys that have played the position at a really high level that I would be equally as interested in.
You said you've been watching tape from the Combine for the last 5 days. Are any of those guys an Armand Membo? You have Calvin Banks, Tyler Booker. Who else is on your list that really popped for you?
I got to say, Membo, he's really piqued my interest because of how big he is, how athletic he is, how strong he is in the type of 40 he ran, which I really don't take into the 40 into consideration. I look at the 10-yard burst. I look at their vertical jump and those types of things to really see leg power. The only thing that I would be concerned about Membo is he's more of a career right tackle. And I don't want to transition a guy that has never played the left tackle position, as difficult as it is, and ask him to play and change everything about his game that's important in playing left tackle that you need to have to be successful. To me, I want to find guys that are going to be brought aboard to play the position that they've invested the last 2 to 4 years in.
All right, am I crazy to think that the trades, and then I'm going to make an assumption, or I hope that they go after a Drew Dahlman in free agency next week and address that center position. Does this allow the Bears to draft best player available at number 10 and say Ashton Genty was there? We saw what Ben Johnson had available to him and Jahmyr Gibbs, who was taken in the first round in Detroit. Do the Bears can you see them taking a running back, or would that be crazy?
You know, to me, I'm still going to look at the defensive linemen that are out there, because, you know, there's a couple of defensive linemen out that are off the charts. And if you could bring in that type of interior talent, especially because you just got rid of DeMarcus Walker, and you got to have as much point of emphasis and improvement on the interior of the defensive line that you do on the entire offensive line. So I'm nothing against Genty. I think he's a brilliant player. I just think he's got all the assets in the world. But if you don't have an offensive line that's providing you running lanes and protection for the quarterback, it's going to be difficult to have a running back come in here and be the superstar he was in college if you don't have the blocking up front, or you don't have the ability on defense to stop the running up front. And to me, you look at the success that Philadelphia had and the way that team is built. And I always say Philadelphia this year is the most similar team to the '85 Bears that I've ever seen, because if you look at how dominant their offense and defensive line are, and then you go out and you win the Super Bowl, to me, I think that's the template that you would like to follow.
All right, so if we're predicting the future for week 1, who will be on the Bears starting offensive line?
All right, let's go Will Campbell, Joe Thuney, Jonah Jackson at right guard, Darnell Wright at right tackle, and center is yet to be determined.
Ooh, okay. So you're having Will Campbell at left tackle.
Yes.
All right. Wow. That would be really fun. I think that changes the perception of the Bears big time if that were to be their starting offensive line. And we know that Ryan Poles said a year ago that it was the most depth he'd had on an offensive line. That would be a game changer, especially just pour into your quarterback that you just drafted a year ago, #1 overall, and then he went on to be sacked 68 times.
Right. And, you know, the thing about it is when you have Ben Johnson installing a new system, every one of these guys are going to be learning at the same pace. And one thing that we talked about is the lack of continuity on the offensive line and how much it affects your entire offense. if you could settle on 5 guys after the draft and going into OTAs and then into training camp, that you're super confident that that's going to be the group of guys you're going to go to bat with week 1 of the regular season, I think you could do a lot for Caleb. You could do a lot for the running game. The competition at practice will be upgraded against the defensive line you're practicing against. So I do think the Bears, Ryan Poles and his staff, are capable of putting a group of 5 together before the season ever begins to go to classroom and then go to work with on the field.
Question about the center position and just having a veteran there, though, because we know Caleb was in charge of so many different protections and identifying things at the line of scrimmage. A lot of responsibility was placed on him as a rookie. Can having an experienced center alleviate some of that responsibility, or does that not change?
No, experience at the center position is always has a role in importance, because you have to identify the direction of the protection and who you're responsible for. That's not in a 3-point stance. And I think when you can get that guy to correctly identify, it gives the quarterback peace of mind of where the vulnerability and the protection will now lie. They know that everybody is going to be blocked on whichever side they're pointing to. And, that's something that the centers start doing in college and carried through their entire career in the NFL.
All right, last question for you, Tom Thayer. We were all wondering what kind of influence Ben Johnson would have on personnel decisions. What does the trade, especially with Jonah Jackson, kind of indicate when we're asking that question?
Listen, he's the head coach of the Chicago Bears, and he has to work in tandem with Ryan Poles. So any type of discussion or suggestion that Ben Johnson wants to have, I'm going to investigate it thoroughly. And obviously, having a background with Jonah Jackson and understanding what the offensive line means to the overall success of the performance of the offense, I'm in a room with him, lockstep, in taking all the suggestions and conversations. But I want it to be pro and con. I want there to be some conversation about it. But I have a lot of respect for what he's just dealt with in Detroit, the transition of that team, and I expect him to do the same here in Chicago.
All right, Tom Thayer, I appreciate your time. We're going to mark it here that arm length doesn't matter, and you believe Will Campbell will be the starting left tackle of the Chicago Bears in 2025.
Let's hope so. There's other candidates, but I do like Will Campbell. He reminds me a lot of Jimbo.
All right, thanks, Tom. Appreciate your time.